Today we are reviewing the next chapter in the book, The Lives of the Stoics by Ryan Holiday and Stephen Hanselman. It's called Diotimus the Vicious, and it's a different kind of lesson than the chapters that preceded it. I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along with the outline that I've got. So the chapter begins with this ominous paragraph. It was Shakespeare, the great observer of the Stoics, who would say, in his most Stoic play no less, that the good we do in life is easily forgotten, but the evil we do lives on and on. Well, I think this is a rephrasing of a famous quote by Shakespeare. There's a related quote in the play Julius Caesar. Some of you who've read that may remember in Act 3 that Caesar has been killed in scene 1, and then Antony gives this famous speech in scene 2. That's the speech that begins with, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." Well, this speech also includes the famous line, "The evil that men do lives after them." And I think Ryan has written this opener to introduce this dark chapter in the book of Stoicism. And it's a chapter that does involve the teacher or the Stoic named Diotimus. So we're going to soon see why the chapter begins this way. I've collected an outline. The first item on my list is to talk about who Diotimus was. His birth and his death were not recorded. We only know that he lived about 100 BC, and we don't know his origins exactly. We don't know his family, we don't know his teachers, but we do know that he was one of the Middle Stoics. And from this picture that you see on your screen, this is compliments of Wikipedia, we can see the layout that the early Stoics were people like Zeno of Citium and Diogenes of Babylon, and then come along the Middle Stoics like Antipater and Panidius, whom we've discussed earlier. Diotimus is also in this Middle Stoic area. And then the later Stoics are people like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Those last three are also sometimes referred to as the Roman Stoics because they came really in the Roman period. All right, so moving along, why is Diotimus so malicious or vicious, as Ryan says? Well, this is the part of the history of his life that we do know about, is he wrote slanderous letters about Epicurus. And Ryan mentions this in the chapter that there were about 50 forged letters. He says that the letters were designed to hurt the reputation of the Epicurean school. Now, elsewhere on the web, I did find other mentions of this, that the forged letters were actually supposed to be by Epicurus himself. And Ryan doesn't say this explicitly, but I think that these letters were forged to be by Epicurus, and they were supposed to reveal that Epicurus was a sinful person or even a maniac of some sort. This is why Ryan has come up with the nickname Vicious for Diotimus. Item number 3, we should talk about the backstory. Why did Diotimus do this? Well, this is another area of uncertainty, but to give you this backstory, in the 1st century BC, Stoicism was in the middle of its famous 500 years, as the scholars refer to it. That is, Stoicism was born about 300 BC and lasted in this early period through 180 AD, which was the death of Marcus Aurelius. Now, during this time of the 1st century BC, when Diotimus did this revengeful act, we don't know exactly what was happening then, but the Epicurean school seems to be rising in popularity. And so, besides being just a competing school, we think that it could be that Diotimus was reacting to that rising popularity, or it also could be that the past leader of the Epicurean school, called Apollodorus, had shamed the Stoic leader, Chrysippus, and had shamed him, saying that he had stolen quotes from many other philosophers. So it could have been one of those things, competing popularity or another shaming in public. Item number 4 brings us to Diotimus as the anti-hero or the villain. I would observe that in the previous chapters of this book, we've reviewed Stoics in history who offered some great idea that is still applicable today, or we can improve our Stoic practice with. But here, Diotimus is really a lesson of what not to do. And I think Ryan succinctly says it in this chapter that supposedly Stoics should be, quote, beyond grudges, beyond revenge, and beyond petty competition. So we don't know what irked Diotimus so much, but he is an example that Stoics can make mistakes. And in this history, I think that the fascinating thing that probably happened is that the Epicurean school leader, the current leader at that time, when Diotimus was writing these fraudulent letters, the Epicurean school leader was named Zeno of Sidon. And he actually took Diotimus to court and won for slander. Diotimus was supposedly sentenced to death, which was very harsh for slander in those days. And we don't actually know if that sentence was carried out or not, but one historian named Athenaeus wrote in his famous work called the Dipnosophistae, he wrote that Diotimus was sentenced to death. And it's only a brief mention. It's a mention that even has flaws in it, but it seems to indicate that the death sentence was carried out. Scholars are a little bit skeptical because it's just a single mention. The thing that I find interesting in this part of the history is the book that I mentioned, the Dipnosophistae, is actually a 15-volume work by the author Athenaeus, and it describes the lives of over 800 scholars and philosophers in the previous few hundred years. It's kind of like an ancient version of the lives of the Stoics that we're studying in this series. So that's an interesting book I'm going to be looking for more on the web. I don't know how much of it is still preserved today. Now this brings us to item 5 on the outline, which is learning our lesson from Diotimus. I think that both ancient and modern Stoics have taught us the value of reasoning and of thinking carefully when certain events happen to us. And I think that we value the reason and the rational thought because we know that it helps us make a better decision. If something were to happen in our lives and we feel like revenge, we should instead think about this reasoning and rationality as a better way, a more virtuous way to live, because otherwise we're going to be burning our negative energy or the energy that we could be using on some more positive response, or even just considering how to solve the problem. So beyond resorting to those negative emotions like Diotimus did, I think we could learn from someone like, for example, Viktor Frankl, who often urged in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he talked about not just being virtuous and being rational, but also preserving our character. That was very important to Viktor Frankl, and he called it one of the fulfilling things in life. So preserving your character can be an important thing also. Now we move to number 6. Before we wrap up, I had to cover the interesting angle of Seneca's writings. Seneca the Younger, as Ryan notes in this chapter, is an author who mentioned Epicureans many times in his works. And however, Seneca never mentioned this sad history of Diotimus. And I agree, it's a notable omission. Even in my copy of Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, it's the Robin Campbell introduction that says that the first 30 letters by Seneca had many mentions of Epicurus and Epicureans. And the overall tone, it's noteworthy that the tone is overall friendly. So what did Seneca think about Diotimus? We really don't know. We may never know. It may take some other scroll to be unearthed for us to find out. Well, this brings us to number 7, the conclusion for this chapter on Diotimus, is I wanted to include the quotes of 3 of my favorites, Viktor Frankl, Marcus Aurelius, and Gandhi. And if we are to learn from the mistakes of Diotimus, we could consider these words. Viktor Frankl said, "Between the stimulus and the response, there is a space." Marcus Aurelius said, "If thou art pained by any external thing, it is not this thing that disturbs thee, but thine own judgment about it. And it is thy power to wipe out this judgment now." And finally, Gandhi has a great quote, timeless quote, "An eye for an eye will only make the whole world blind." Wow, that's inspiring. Well, all these quotes I consider to be timeless wisdom for cases like when you're feeling anger or revenge. And if any of these 3 authors were alive and in our Zoom call today, I think that they might explain why their quotes, why these concepts are so important. Viktor Frankl might comment that the space that he spoke about, that the first thing we must do is know that it exists, not just use it to use reason and to make better decisions, but to recognize that that space is always there for situations like this. And Marcus, talking about wiping away a judgment, it reminds us that judgments can be false, and we should instead seek virtue. We should take our time and seek virtue in cases like that. And finally, Gandhi, with his common ground statement that really reaches everyone on the planet, we can use that to realize that if we perpetuate negativity and violence, we really destroy the world. Thanks for your attention today.